Welcome back to Manuscript Minutes. I'm Courtney.
And I'm Kaylen, and today we're going to be looking at manuscript provenance, which is a term that describes where a manuscript spent its life.
Naturally, the place where it's made can be the place where it stayed, but that doesn't have to be the case. Manuscripts moved around.
We can consider provenance in terms of evidence and historical era. With respect to historical era, we may want to know the medieval, early modern, or recent provenance of a manuscript. For example, in which monastic library did this Bible reside in the 13th century, and then in which humanist library did it settle in the 16th century?
Or who purchased it in the 20th century, and at what auction, and for what price? En route to the present day, was the Bible damaged or altered by, for example, rebinding or mutilation?
From the evidentiary perspective, we want to consider the kinds of medieval or modern evidence available for determining provenance. The best evidence usually derives from inscriptions, especially those recording ownership. It doesn't get any better, for instance, than encountering an inscription that reads, "This book belongs to the Abbey of Our Lady of Bec," or something similar. In this way, we can pinpoint manuscripts precisely, at least for the period covered by the date of the handwriting. Latin formulas can also provide evidence as to provenance, since different monastic orders had unique ways of expressing ownership of a manuscript.
Sometimes inscriptions can be considered inferential evidence of provenance if they consist of personal names, place names, shelf marks, or even rare quotations.
We can often triangulate evidence from other sources, such as library catalogs, to arrive at a conjectural provenance. More subtle is textual evidence. When manuscripts are copied, mistakes are made, and those mistakes often get transmitted, so that eventually one encounters families of manuscripts with the same mistakes. If we knew the provenance of one copy in which idiosyncratic mistakes were made, we can associate other copies with that same location, perhaps the daughter house of an abbey that needed copies of manuscripts to establish a library. So, in theory, if there was another manuscript of this kind that featured the same mistake, we can reasonably assume that this manuscript was produced in the same location at the same time.
The same evidence of textual association happens to be true for exceptionally rare texts that survive in, say, two locations.
We can infer, if we know the provenance of one manuscript with this rare text, that a second copy might have been made either in the same place or nearby.
For modern provenance, we often have evidence provided by bookplates. Bookplates sometimes record the name of an owner, but sometimes the evidence they convey consists merely of a coat of arms and family motto. With this evidence, we can determine the family who owned the manuscript, and perhaps by looking at the style of a bookplate, calculate an approximate date of ownership.
Finally, if our manuscript has a calendar where obscure local saints are identified, or perhaps a litany with similarly unfamiliar saints, we can often determine the area of a book's production or use by looking at the dioceses where these saints were venerated.
Now, let's look at some examples of medieval provenance.
Let's begin with this theological compendium from Vivenzano in northern Italy. We can determine the northern Italian origin and 15th century date from the script. Yet our manuscript happens to have the best kind of provenance evidence: two inscriptions that identify its ownership by a Franciscan order in Vivenzano.
The inscriptions are both in Italian. The first one reads, Dea Libreria di San Francesco di Fivizzano, or from the Library of St. Francis of Fivizzano. Both inscriptions look to be 17th century, so we might infer that our manuscript was produced for this monastery in the 15th century and stayed put in its library before somehow migrating to the United States. The book may have entered the marketplace after the Napoleonic campaign in the early 19th century Italy. This 13th century Bible from Oxford also bears an ownership inscription, although in this case it has been erased. It is very common to encounter such erasures which prevented any debate about the legitimate ownership of a book that had changed hands. Imaging done at Stanford University's research synchrotron enabled us to read this inscription, which looks to be early 14th century. The text reads, Liber fratris Ade de Afford, inter minores de dono fratris Ricardi de C. Samford, or the Book of Brother Adam of Afford, among the Minorites by gift of Brother Richard of C. Samford. Now that we know this Oxford Bible belonged to a Franciscan, we might ask ourselves whether these names can be identified.
For this stage of the work, we must consult A.B. Emden's Biographical Register of the University of Oxford to AD 1500. Brother Adam of Afford cannot be identified with any certainty, but a certain Richard of Congington is a perfect candidate to be Ricardus de C.,
which bestowed the Bible on Brother Adam. Emden's book tells us that Richard of Congington was the regent master of Franciscans at Oxford. In this context, it's important to realize that Franciscan friars were not allowed to own property, and that the phrase, by gift of, means that the book was a lifetime loan. As Franciscan master, Richard was just the person to loan a valuable book to a recent graduate belonging to his order. His dates perfectly coincide with the inscription.
The next inscription we want to look at is in this missal. In this case, we need to appreciate that the missal is Northern Italian and obviously Dominican. It has an abundance of masses for St. Dominic. On a flyleaf at the front of the manuscript, we find an inscription entitled Nomina Mortuorum, or Names of the Deceased. Here are the first 4 lines. Item Herr Leonhardt von Leeuwenberg Ritter, item Petermann von Leeuwenberg, item Herr Hildbrandt of Passier ab Joffenberg Ritter, item Herr Christophus Fuchs Ritter, Frau Barbara Uxor. This means Sir Leonhardt of Leeuwenberg, Knight, Betermann of Leeuwenberg, Sir Hildbrandt of Passier of Joffenberg, Knight, and Sir Christoph Fuchs, Knight, and Lady Barbara, his wife.
When you look up these names, you discover that they identify a family in South Tyrol of Italy whose lands lay close to Bolzano. Recall that our manuscript is Dominican.
It cannot be coincidental that the Dominican monastery in Bolzano was the largest in the entire region, and our manuscript likely originated there. Incidentally, Leeuwenberg Castle still survives, and it is still an imposing and atmospheric place even today.
Our 4th example is more subtle. In this case, we have a collection of medieval sermons found in a manuscript dated 1269.
Written by someone educated at the University of Paris, these sermons can be identified in Schneier's book Repertorium der Lateinischen Sermones des Mittelalters. When we explore the other copies of these sermons listed by Schneier, we discover that they are found elsewhere only in a Naples manuscript from the 14th century, Biblioteca Nazionale Manuscript 8A40, which comes from the convent of St. Francis in Capistrano.
All the sermons begin with a pericope that the priest will explicate on the day. In our sermon here, the Latin text begins, Veritas de Terra, so we find the same pericope as it appears in Schneier's book. After Veritas de Terra, the sermon in the manuscript continues, Exponentur verba ista de. We can see here that we will need volume 5, page 603.
And here we have volume 5, page 603, and here it is. This is our sermon. It's T6, so it's the 6th homily of the Temporale. As it turns out, almost all of the sermons in our manuscript appear in this one. We only know of 2 manuscripts that contain these sermons, and they exist nowhere else in the world as far as we know. Since we know this one is from Capistrano, we can suspect that this Cistercian manuscript must come from that region.
The rarity of text shared only by this manuscript and the Breslau compilation therefore suggests a provenance in the Abruzzo region of central Italy. At least 5 Cistercian abbeys were established there, and any of them could have been home to our manuscript.
This ambiguity is an important aspect of provenance research. One rarely achieves absolute certainty about a manuscript's chain of ownership, but it is exceptionally rare to learn the complete history of a medieval book from the time it is made to its whereabouts today. By studying the transmission of a medieval book from any period of its existence, we can learn important details about the intellectual environment in which it was read.
Stay tuned for our next video in which we discuss modern provenance and build off of the information that we learned in this video.